Hello, hello. I'll give everyone a moment to connect to sound here. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1292nd New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring David Nolan, Valentina Branchini, and William Corwin. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. David Nolan is an Irish gallerist who specializes in modern and contemporary art. Nolan began his career in 1980 at Michael Werner Gallery in Cologne and moved to New York in 1983 to work with Ileana Sonnabend. In 1987, he opened David Nolan Gallery, juxtaposing work made in a variety of media by international artists from different generations and cultures, as well as mounting tightly curated historical exhibitions. The gallery represents contemporary artists as they build their careers, along with mature late career artists in a number of estates. Valentina Branchini has been part of the David Nolan Gallery team since 2016. Born and raised in Bologna, Italy, she has been active in the visual arts since a teenager, working at a paintings conservator's private practice until she earned a PhD scholarship in art history with a dissertation on Flemish landscape painter Simon Dennis. At Ville Itati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence, she was project manager for cataloging and digitizing the Berenson Library's photograph archive. Our host today, sculptor and journalist William Corwin, is from New York. He has exhibited at galleries in New York, London, Hamburg, Beijing, and Taipei. He has written regularly for the Brooklyn Rail, Art Papers, Bomb, Art Critical, Rain Taxi, and Canvas. Most recently, he curated and wrote the catalog for post-war women at the Art Students League in New York, an exhibition of the school's alumnae active between 1945 and 65. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Will.
Great. It's a wonderful privilege to get to talk to Valentina and David today. My first contact with the David Nolan Gallery was actually through the Rail. I interviewed one of their artists, Alexander Ross, for the Rail, and went to the show, got to know the artist, enjoyed the kind of freedom and bizarreness that came through his work, and then became sort of a regular visitor to the gallery. So what I'd like to do first is address a question to both David and Valentina independently. I guess the first thing that I think comes into anyone's mind when talking about galleries is what made you start the gallery, and how did you end up becoming an art dealer? So let's start with a little bit of autobiography. And I guess if we're going to do it in order, David, you started in Germany with Michael Werner, but what made you decide to start your own gallery in 1987?
Well, very briefly, succinctly as possible. So yes, I grew up in Ireland. My father died when I was quite young, and I had two uncles who really encouraged everything that a young man should do, from cultural activities. And I had this uncle, Desmond McCulloch, who had these soirees for artists and writers when I was a teenager. And he forced me to do them. I had another uncle, of course, who got me to go hunting and do all of those other things. But it was really Desmond who opened up my eyes to art. And his art was basically from art that he had collected and spent time with in Paris in the 40s and 50s. And he and I would go to museums together, galleries together, and we would argue over what we saw. I didn't realize at the time, but he was forcing me to argue to get me to figure out what my taste was and what my take was on art. And pretty soon, I became very excited. I studied architecture briefly and wanted to be an architect. But at the same time, I was collecting art from the age of 16. And short after a few years of doing that, I thought I would love to bring great contemporary art to Ireland and basically educate the Irish people on contemporary art, which I felt there wasn't enough of at the time. And by pure coincidence, I met a German art dealer in the west of Ireland who had a house there, who invited me to come to Cologne and to work at his gallery and be the director. And shortly after that, I met Michael Werner, and decided that Michael Werner was, he needed my help to make his gallery better. But what I didn't realize was he was at that point showing Kiefer and Baselitz and Marcel Brothers. And the artists that he showed with such commitment and passion really convinced me that art was a much bigger thing than I had realized at first. And after working with him for a few years, and since he'd been in business for a number of years, one of his great things was to show artists over a period of time and media. So if you wanted to see a Baselitz painting, you could also see a Baselitz painting from the last 20 years. You could look at drawings of his. And through my day-to-day working at Michael's, my passion for art grew much deeper. And I really trusted artists at that point. And that was the early 80s when the world woke up in a way to German art, to Kiefer, to Baselitz, to Penck, to Immendorf, many of those people. And so a number of art dealers in New York offered me a job. And so I came, and very, to make it succinct, I decided I wanted to work with Ileana Sonnabend. Worked with Ileana Sonnabend for over 3 years, and her gallery was a very different international gallery than Michael Werner's. And yes, at that point, I had decided what my loves were, and that no gallery would really show the things that I wanted to show enough, and decided to open my own gallery. And one of the things that I thought the American dealers didn't do very well at the time was to show artists in depth. It was more about the newest work that they made, and I felt it needed context. And one of the ways I decided to do that was through works on paper. Paper as in drawings, the sort of direct link to the artist's inspiration. I think it's a vulnerable, almost naked way of the artist showing who they are. And there are both studies for ideas, and they're also very finished drawings. So drawing seemed to me the way to go, and I think up until now, drawing is a central part of what David Nolan Gallery does, both contemporary and classical. And I still think that knowing and showing drawings gives people a much deeper understanding of what art is about, contemporary and classical. So I opened the gallery in 87. And of course, it was a little German-centric because I'd spent a number of years in Germany. And when I came over here to work for Ileana Sonnabend, I also brought German artists with me, like Immendorf and Penck and Kiefer and so on. So I started off with, to me, a straightforward idea was Sigmar Polke of the 60s, which works on paper primarily. And that really opened up a dialogue with artists, and many artists liked that I showed drawings and I was willing to focus on them, even though they were less expensive than paintings. And sometimes that makes it more of a challenge because they weren't expensive enough back then. Now they have changed. And as I say, drawings is a foundation of what we do, but we mix it with many other things.
So Valentina, how did you make your way to the art world, and how did you become part of, I know that we're kind of switching in time frames because you came to the gallery much later than 1987, but how did you get started? Let's talk, tell your story.
Okay, so in the 90s, I was still in Bologna, in Italy, my hometown. And I grew up in a family where visual arts were not one of the focuses that my parents were interested in, but in our household, books, movies, music, and design, Italian design from the 60s were really some of the favorite elements and pastimes that we would engage with every day. So, but for me, since I was a young teenager, I remember, you know, there are these moments in times that I feel were turning points. Everybody has them. But for me, one day visiting the Uffizi in Florence with my parents, and at that time, a New Zealander teenager that we were putting up for a year for one of her junior year school So we wanted to show all of our treasures. So we took her to the Uffizi, and I was looking at these amazing Renaissance paintings, and I told myself, I know I'm not an artist, but I am so drawn to painting as a technique, as an object, as a symbol of a time in history and political, social, aesthetic expression of an individual or a group of individuals of a community. I want to work with the visual arts. And I think I was 15 at the time, and the next year I knocked on the door of a private practice painting conservator, and I offered my service as a young apprentice. And it was an amazing experience that went on for 8 years every day in my life. And there I met one of my many elective families that was made of students that had come to Bologna from elsewhere in Italy. Many of them were artists, and each afternoon we would spend like 6 hours together working on beautiful paintings, frescoes, but also talking, listening to music, and very cutting edge for my town at that time. And the next turning point, I think, which brings me closer to David's world now is, well, only in the medium. I remember seeing a show of Parmigianino drawings when I was already at the university. And that day I thought, wow, I understand how drawing as a form of expression, as a medium, really goes to the core of the artist's hand, intent, and expression. And it was like, for me, it was the same as getting from Baroque music to classical contemporary. It's a little bit of an acquired taste that I think I could express and experience and appreciate only by virtue of all of that background that I had accumulated before. But I, since that day, looked at drawings with eagerness and passion. And so to now shorten the story, but I came to New York because I had specialized after my PhD on a neoclassical landscape painter. I really specialized in photography, early photography in particular, starting in Italy, in Bologna and Florence, but then in Rochester, New York, the home of Kodak. And I went to Chicago, the Art Institute, for a Mellon Fellowship in photo conservation. And what I was interested in through the conservators' connoisseurship was not becoming a bench working restorer, but actually understanding the media, the tools and the techniques that would allow an artist working with those materials and processes to achieve their intent, sometimes serendipitously or sometimes by virtue of precise determined choices. And so I then started working with one of the most sublime dealers in New York in early photography, Hans P. Krauss Jr., and he really specializes in the earliest photos on paper ever made in England. And there I worked for 7 years, doing everything at the gallery, from mounting shows to doing historical research, analysis of the techniques. And then I met David at that time, and we decided to try and work together because I was working for another gallery already. I had his art historical background and an eclectic knowledge of media, and so we thought it might be fun to work together. And so for the first time with David Nolan Gallery, I have been working with living artists rather than long dead ones.
Now, David, when you said that you realized that no other gallery would sort of accomplish what you were looking to do in a gallery, were you specifically talking about works on paper, or what else were you looking for?
Yes.
That was
There were two things I wanted to do. One, since I came from Europe, I clearly wanted to bring more European art to America, but it was drawings. And actually, before I left Ileana Sonnabend's gallery, I had proposed to her to split her gallery in two because she had dealt with Rauschenberg and so many great artists whose practice was also 50% of it was works on paper. And that didn't work out in a way because she didn't really want to split her gallery in two. But works on paper was absolutely, because I always felt it was a way to get artists into museums and private collections, and also to show works on paper did relax clients when they were looking at the work. They were sometimes intimidated by a painting or didn't give enough information. So it was both works on paper and bringing, yes, what I had loved and felt people didn't know well enough in this country was contemporary, primarily at that point, German art. So it was both of those things together.
And did that create a kind of, not bi-coastal, but were you kind of commuting from studio, like Polka's studio and Kippenberger's studio and coming back? You talk about how you were very concerned with presenting an artist in their kind of complete sort of lifespan. So how did that work out?
Yeah, that the artist, all of the artists, I would say, even Polka, who was a complicated fellow with a dangerous sense of humor, even Polka thought like, okay, you know, it's a fun idea. I don't think anybody in America is going to care, but if you want to knock yourself out, go ahead. But most other artists in Germany loved the idea. I mean, they thought it was courageous and a little foolish, but I was totally convinced this was the way to go. And I, you know, even the polka show was basically the first show that I had at my gallery. And there were a few other art dealers who said, you know, nice try, but nobody will take this seriously. And I discovered straight away that the Museum of Modern Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, San Francisco museums around the country, and Harvard. I had a Konrad Oberhuber, who was the director over there at the time. No, he gave me such a hard time, but he loved that a gallery in New York was doing that. And he would use my visits to Harvard to sell him artwork to educate his students at the same time by giving me a hard time and explaining, like, why is this drawing important? Why is this artist important? And I think by having to work a little harder and explaining the artists' careers, it also helped me to be, if I'm allowed to say it, a better art dealer, because I was very close to the artists and their ideas. And it was a fun, interesting challenge. But yeah, I remember Holly Solomon, after I'd opened the gallery, I was very close to her. And she said, unlike Ileana, who was my first client, that I was told that, you know, give it 6 months. But I also felt that people were more interested at that time in works on paper, and paintings were becoming really expensive, and people, they needed something else to look at and to understand what art was about. So my timing was fortunate, I feel.
Yes, and also, I mean, you know, the benefit of hindsight. Why were people so, and not to digress too much, but why were people so doubtful about presenting German art I mean, now it seems like these are the sort of, a lot of these are sort of the towering figures of the 80s. Why would anyone question that? I mean, why were they so incredulous?
I think there's sort of a simple answer. There's never a simple answer because there's always many levels to it. But I would say the simple answer is that German art, certainly for America, and America was the great art power. The economy was strong. It was the Americans who came to Europe after the Second World War and built up all of those great collections, like the Pulitzer collection. Many people from America, I mean, Frick, all of these people, they were buying European art, and because the Europeans didn't have the same economic freedom, flexibility, and really wealth. So I think the German art was seen as being provincial at that moment and not forward looking. But I knew differently. And I think Kiefer and Baselitz, the big change in the early 80s, Kiefer and Baselitz, when they represented Germany at the Venice Biennale, that was the first time many American, and I mean New York, dealers took those artists seriously. And then there was a new spirit in painting at the Royal Academy in London in 81, which put them together with like Polka, Richter, Baselitz, all of those artists were put together with Francis Bacon, Freud, and all of these other art, and de Kooning. So people were changing their mind about German art at that time, but it had seemed provincial. And I knew artists in this country like Schnabel and David Sally and Fischl, they all knew the European art, and they knew Polka and Baselitz extremely well. And I would say that in the beginning of Baselitz and Polka and Richter being shown here, it was the powerful artists of the New York scene who were telling all the clients, this is what we've been looking at, this is what we respect. So it did change, but prior to that, no, it was English art or French art, not German art.
So Valentina, we discussed this sort of before, you know, the start of the NSE, but there's the sense I got just looking through the exhibitions that you brought a kind of historical perspective, an interest in doing historical exhibitions. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but I mean, I know that there was a fantastic two-part show of Klaus Curtis's legacy with the Bikert Gallery, and then a wonderful show called Mad Women about women art dealers in New York. So can you talk a bit about did you bring this historical side to the gallery, and then talk about the shows the historical shows that you created for the gallery?
So I cannot take credit for this because it has been part of the history of the gallery before my time. For example, one of the shows that I never saw in person, but that I am aware of, that David mounted, among many others that I could mention, was one where David showed probably works on paper, by Andy Warhol, George Grosz, and Wardell Milan. So 3 different generations and cultures side by side. And so that, yes, I consider that a historical show also because it put in perspective and dialogue works coming from contexts that not necessarily somebody else would connect. But that's what I mean by history and an art historical approach when you create juxtapositions or you challenge a little bit the concept, which is the common idea, by creating new perspectives. So I think David and his gallery were already very prone to this, but it's true that I, with my passion and background in art history, one of my favorite activities ever is researching in an archive. So now it has become, with the technology of today, very easy to do research in image databases, but I also intend an archive that really houses historical documents and doing a detective work. So it's true that shows like our homage to Klaus Curtis and his Bikert Gallery in 2 parts was very much a collaboration with me and David, but I think the idea was also David's, not only mine. And the Mad Women show that I will talk about a little bit more very soon was actually an idea that came up when David and I were talking with our friend and colleague Damon Brandt. So the Bikert show that David could also add something upon, but was a very happy coincidence. We relocated the gallery from Chelsea, and you saw a slide of the beautiful building that housed David Nolan Gallery in Chelsea for 12 years, from 2008 until lockdown, COVID time, where the facade had been designed by Richard Archwager. So David was blessed by this wonderful contribution by one of his loyal and amazing artists. So when we moved to the current premise of the gallery on the Upper East Side on 81st Street, we were aware of the fact that the building has been the premise for galleries before us, but we hadn't really realized that Biker Gallery had been here since, between 1969 to 1975. And that was such a serendipitous realization, because Klaus had been a friend of David's, a friend of David's gallery, and a supporter. He had written essays for David Nolan Gallery's publications, and also, not so surprisingly, because I think David and Klaus were never met, but actually one of the first things that David and I ever did together was attending his memorial at the Whitney.
At the Whitney
yes.
Museum.
Was that they really shared a vision in contemporary art, in art history. And so, not surprisingly, David shows and has been showing at least two of the artists that Klaus showed very early on in the late 60s and 70s, Dorothea Rockburn and Barry LeVay, being two of the artists that were among the stars that we chose for these two-part tribute to Klaus.
But the thing that I'd like to just add and get Valentina to talk about is that, yes, I did do some historical shows, but the way we put the shows together now, and the Mad Women, which I'd like Valentina to talk about, the way she researches is something I had never done before, never done in this art historical, critical way that she does. And she mentioned detective work and delving into things or to the past. Valentina does that really well. And the Mad Women show, also because we moved the gallery uptown to Madison Avenue, led Valentina to say, there's a great history of Madison Avenue. I'd like to explore that. And I think you should say a little bit more about the Mad Women show and the research.
Okay. So Damon, who was the co-curator of the show, initially had spoken about how he liked the idea of making a historical show with us at the gallery in the Upper East Side, showing the history of galleries that had preceded me and David, where couples were running their gallery, like in the 1950s and 60s. That was the focus. And then while we were talking one day, he said, but how about actually we just focus on galleries run and owned by women? And we came up with this title that, of course, plays with Mad Men, and how in the 60s, the Madison Avenue advertising world was so dominated by the male figure. And I actually, for that show, it was a lot of work, but also of good challenges. Like I took upon all the graphic works for the PR press releases, and I found that one of those two small paintings by Rosalind Drexler that we showed, with the man and the woman smoking on a black background with the dominating colors being bright orange and red, were so also very much in the graphic that had connotated Mad Men as a TV show, but also as a historically researched portrait of that time. And so the Mad Women could have been many more than the four that we focused on because of logistical restrictions. And they were four fabulous women: Martha Jackson, Eleanor Ward, Eleanor Sonnabend and Jill Cornbly. They were all active in the 1960s and either before or after, but that's the decade that we wanted to analyze. And we decided to intersperse works by artists that they showed in that decade and putting them in a conversation. And in some cases, like for example, one of the Louise Bourgeois works that we had on view, it's the sculpture. I'm smiling because Will actually wrote a beautiful review of the show, and he described that that sculpture almost like a fecal piece in text. Yes, that had been one of the works that actually had been on view in the 60s. So in some cases, we were able to really find and get to the exact work that had been in one of these 4 galleries on view in the Madison Avenue area in the 60s. And I also had a lot of fun researching a lot of brochures or posters or invitation cards, so ephemera, that we mounted also as part of the show to give some context and also expand on the design, even the use of the font. And one of the things that I was really fascinated and guides me a little bit in my being a gallerist in New York, in Manhattan these years, was seeing how a lot of these galleries, not only run by women, but you know, no gender distinctions, but they really collaborated on groundbreaking projects. Like, for example, Eleanor Sonnabend, who, it was interesting, the 4 women we chose, each one was different because of their background. Some came from privileged families and histories, some did not. So that was not the only possibility at that time, which was interesting to see. But also somebody like Eleanor Sonnabend, who, by the way, was one of the co-founders of the Art Dealers Association of America in 1962, had been chosen by Picasso and his Paris dealer, Kahnweiler, to be the sole US representative of Picasso. So women with a huge charisma, big risk-taking, courage, capability. And so, for example, the slide you're seeing was actually mostly works by artists that Sonnabend would represent, but also Martha Jackson. There is a work by Louise Bourgeois, Lee Bonteque, put in dialogue with Fabulous Dubuffet, Picasso, and other established European artists that Sonnabend would show. Whereas Eleanor Ward with her stable gallery was more cutting edge. Martha Jackson, who had studied art history with Hoffman, was very eclectic in her taste and showed probably the highest number of women artists. At that time, showing women artists didn't seem to be a particular worry in the agenda of an art gallery.
Mm-hmm.
Jill Cornbly was very intellectual, very cutting edge, and conceptual in her shows. So each one had a slightly different aesthetic and selection of artists. But what is fabulous to me is that, yes, they all contributed with other galleries in, for example, Sonnabend spearheaded a Picasso show where 6 galleries in New York showed each one a different aspect of Picasso's art. And it was made for charity, so also visitors could buy a like an individual ticket to see the show at one specific gallery, or a whole ticket for the entire show. But it was so wonderful to see how there was the possibility and desire and the realistic realization of gorgeous collaboration between colleagues. And so that it really inspired me in how we work, David and I together. We really welcome collaborations with dealers, colleagues.
Which is a nice thing. And actually even Michael Finlay, who's a great orator, writer, and art dealer, Michael Finlay really also advised both Damon and Valentina on that show because he'd lived through that period. And one of the things that I think Michael said that was great at that time was galleries used to collaborate a lot more than they do now. They do occasionally now, but in the past, to do like 5 galleries to come and do one artist together, Rauschenberg had tried to do that a few times and did. Kippenberger tried unsuccessfully, but I think the idea of bringing a bunch of galleries together, I think it's a great idea and one that would be fun to do more of.
And Picasso was just one, but for example, I think Martha Jackson with other galleries, they all united forces to launch emerging optical artists. So it was also to help younger, lesser known artists and their visibility to expand their work and creating really an event with more than one gallery at the same time.
Well, that show, I mean, considering that it was in sort of 3 moderate-sized rooms, it had a depth of historical analysis and comparison and a richness that really gave you a sense of each of the four dealers and what her ideology and exhibiting was. It's interesting because it then makes me think of it's like a mirror to the Nolan Gallery itself, because I know there's the German artists, but I sort of feel like I see resonances, and I'm curious if they're, how specific they are and how careful they are. Like I feel like there's a kind of a subtext of satire. You have Peter Saul. You seem to have a dedication to George Gross and Jonathan Mies. I'm curious if that's something. And then I see resonances between Mel Kendrick and Barry LeVay. Is this something that you say this is what the Nolan Gallery is meant to represent? Is that, or do these sort of mostly just happen over the 30, 40 years that you've been working?
It usually happens over drinks. No, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the history of the German aspect is something I take very seriously because I think it's been a huge influence on art around the world since the early 20th century. I think the art schools, I think the amount of artists who've come out of Germany, even though, I mean, I did spend some time, so I'm slightly biased, but I think putting the shows together, I think it's to show an aspect of something earlier, like here, George Gross from the teens and 20s. I think that really does speak to Jonathan Mies, who indeed, Jonathan's satirical and critical way of looking at the world around us and how we need to rip open all of the censorship and we really need to go to the root of who we are, is definitely part of what the gallery has liked to show. And also, I think Peter Saul, in a political way too, does the same thing. And they all look back to George Gross and many of those heroes. And here we have a big installation of Barry LeVay. And Barry LeVay and Dorothea Rockburn and Mel Kendrick speak to another aspect, slightly more conceptual, let's say, but it is also, it's parallel, but it intertwines. I think an artist who came out of the 70s in a way, the late 70s, would be somebody like Carol Dunham. And putting Carol Dunham together with Barry LeVay is also a perfect juxtaposition. So I think one of the things, the goals of the gallery is to make the visual experience an intellectual one too, so that it's thoughtful. It's not just about business. Business is an essential part of it because these days, particularly, everything is more expensive. Art fairs have become outrageously expensive, so business is an underlying part of it. But I think the gallery wants to juxtapose things in a way that people wouldn't have thought of. And actually, one of the things I think Valentina and I both really are excited about, we're both clearly very passionate about art, but I think dealing with artists and spending time with them in their studios, talking about their ideas, we also learn so much from being with them. It is, it's the perfect job in the world in a way. We have to travel around the world, to Brazil, to wherever we're traveling, to look at art and to see how that will fit into what we're doing. And I think we learn a lot from being around the artists we work with, because they're all very smart. They look at things in a way that we don't look at things. And I want to show that. And Valentina also was interested in the underbelly of culture and bringing that forward. And I think the show that we have now with Dennis Typhus from Antwerp, from Belgium, Jonathan Neeson from Berlin, and this younger artist who we are showing from Omaha, Nebraska, Tim Browner, they're also about showing things together in a way that projects an idea of, let's look at our society, let's look at the world in a different way. It's historical, but they are really speaking to a younger audience. And I think Valentina and I also like to show and bring artists in that speak to a younger audience and not just the audience that we know. We like to test ourselves and test the gallery. And I think Ian Hamilton Findlay is a Scottish concrete poet from the 50s, really. But he really matured more in the sculptures in the 70s and 80s. But bringing somebody like Findlay, who's interested in dealing with history, and if we don't understand our history, we don't really know who we are, which is something I believe firmly in. The more we know about the history of the world, the richer people we are. And Valentina not only saw that as exciting and Finlay's contribution to the world and culture and art and poetry, and then she juxtaposed, and I'll let her say more about it, but she juxtaposed it and said, I want to bring in a younger contemporary artist who I feel also parallel, but today works parallel with some of Finlay's idea, and that was David Hart. And I'd like to ask actually Valentina, if you don't mind, well, how did that Ian Hamilton Findlay and David Hart come together?
So I think in 2022, we had a beautiful show by David Hart at the gallery called In Arcadia Ego, quoting Nicolas Poussin. And well, that citation made me think about a work by Ian Hamilton Findlay. He also had paid attention in many of his works to the Arcadia and that idyllic time with all the contradictions that time, like any historical time in the history of humanity, brings with it. And I thought, I don't know, I had this intuition that the way that Findlay, who was actually, when I met David, and his taste in contemporary art really, in a way, shaped mine, because it is through the filter of his aesthetic that I started looking really at contemporary art, coming from a world of older masters in my previous existence. The two artists that I had been drawn to immediately were Barry Levay and Ian Hamilton Findlay. And Ian Hamilton Findlay, I think organically and naturally, it's very understandable that somebody with a classical background like mine is very easy to decipher and appreciate. Barry Levay, with his mixture of apparent violence, but also the gracefulness of his cleavers dancing almost on their tiptoes on the wall that they were inserted in with force, really touched something in myself. But so one day I had this intuition that the way that Finley looked at the world and art, infused always by the history of humankind, resonated with a very deep kinship to how I understood and loved the work by David Hart. And David Hart, who is Canadian and in his 50s now, lives in Philadelphia, was actually one of the artists from David's program that at the beginning puzzled me, because I didn't feel I had the tools to really understand his work and grasp it. But then it really, because it's so layered and so smart, and it can have so many connections and multi-sensorial ones, and even paying attention to the design of punctuation, just like Finlay did, and how even that is the expression of a very specific but also very universal moment in philosophy, linguistics, literature, and how that is used or it affects its context for a community and for the entire world community, as far as I'm concerned. And so I asked David Hart, are you familiar with Finley's work? And he said, of course, I know the name, yes. I said, but are you really familiar? Have you been to Little Sparta? He said, no, never. And so David and I actually decided to treat him to a couple of days spent in the company of Finley's beautiful garden there. And he came back and we talked about it. And he told me that, yes, he also recognized this very deep resonance with Finley's work. And so that, for me, in my role as a gallerist, was a very satisfying contribution that, like I said, an intuition, an idea could actually plant a seed for this connection to be made. And it became actually a recent show at our gallery where, again, following the example of our predecessors, our Mad Women, we decided actually with the Ian Hamilton Finley Estate to celebrate Finley's centennial earlier this year with a series of 8 exhibitions dedicated to Finley. We were the only gallery in the Americas, but there were another 7 galleries who historically had worked with Finley during his life and posthumously. And so together we opened on the 8th of May, each one showing a different aspect of Ian's work. And our beautiful show was designed by David Hart, who looked to Carlo Scarpa for an idea and inspiration on how to show Finley's work in a way that was different from it had ever been shown before. And
How did David Hart join the gallery? I'm just curious what the background on that.
This photo here is from our Dorothea Rockburn show, and there were 2 parts to it, and this part was dedicated, Valentina can talk even better than I can about this, but to Giotto, who is one of her great heroes, and that chapel in Padua.
La Cappella degli Scrovegni, or Arena Chapel.
So she had an idea, and she has painted walls behind her pieces before, but when she described this idea to us that she would like in some way to have this group of works and imagine it was in this chapel, we then said, well, okay, we'll go one step further. So we put in a fake floor, we closed all the windows, and we made the space into a chapel. So we painted the floor, ceiling, walls, and so on in this blue. but it's this blue, particular blue that she uses in her works. And you can even, well, there it's a slightly different blue, but that was the same show. So one of the things that we like to do occasionally, when possible, is to change how the space reads, to turn it into an installation. We've done it with Chikaya Booker, we've done it with Mel Kendrick, we've done it with a number of artists where you really transform the space. We do it at art fairs occasionally too.
And you told me that she coincidentally had her first exhibition in the same building.
She did with Klaus Curtis in the early 70s. And she is both very happy and I think hopefully still delighted with the fact that we show her now, and that at the age of 96 we are planning another exhibition in the spring with her, that perhaps it'll be the beginning of her career and the end of her career in the same building, which with two people, Klaus Curtis at the beginning and then me at the end closing it. And it's for her a wonderful concept.
Well, it also echoes the shape of a circle, perfect.
Yeah.
That is also very crucial to her vision and aesthetic.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, as art dealers, facing the current art world, I think a lot of people are sort of feeling that there are difficulties arising, that I don't know if they're economic, so entirely, or also political. But I wanted to get your take on the, I don't know, the art world, the market. What do you think is happening right now in the art market, the art world?
I'll start that one since I've been in the business a little longer. But yeah, I mean, to me, I think change is essential, and I think part of that for art dealers, when you want to take an artist on, which has happened to me in the past, where you want to take an artist on and perhaps that didn't work out, and then that forced you to actually think, okay, I want to take another type, and this opened my idea. I think the challenges of a changing world, sometimes they're quite tough, but this is probably, I suspect, the third bump in the road that I've had. The first one, I opened the gallery in the fall of '87, and at the end of the '80s, it was a very tough time. The end of the '90s, when friends of mine would go out of business, and that was upsetting, particularly in '97, '98, when several of my good friends went out of business. I thought, oh my God, I better pay attention. And so I find this is just a natural way. It's changes in the world, changes in the art business, which is why I also said we like to bring in younger artists too. We like to, I mean, we have 100 shows we could do actually, and very excited to do them. But you have to keep changing, you have to keep evolving. And I think for us, it's also, which is why I say being an art dealer is one of the most charming jobs in the world. The communication from critics, from collectors, from curators, from artists, there is a dialogue and it expands your world constantly and also tests it. So I think at the moment, yes, it's a very tough, absolutely. It's a tough time. It's a time of confusion, indecision. This country, like many other countries around the world, and the president of this country seems to thrive on chaos. So it makes our job, we have to be more convincing, more passionate, more tough, and fight more. But that's something that I've always welcomed, because I've never felt that my gallery was never the most successful gallery in New York or the worst. So I've always liked going up and down is part of having a business and a gallery and dealing with artists. You're aware that their careers go up and down too, and their inspiration at some point, it might be going off until they can pull themselves back. So I see it in all of that sort of grand world of it's a tough world, but also a tough world is what creates real things. And I think the show, again, that we have at the moment is about one where, I don't want censorship in art. artists are allowed, in my mind, they have to express what they have to express because that speaks to us and genuinely helps our world and our minds and spirits. And if that were to be censored, then no, I wouldn't want to have a gallery. I would have no interest. It would be boring as hell for myself and for everybody else. And luckily, Valentina and I like that. And like that show there's a photo of a show that we put together with Jack Shear. And Jack has been, I have had a few big supporters of the gallery over the years. Walter Barreis in the 80s and 90s, a man who I learned a tremendous amount. There are, collectors you really do as dealers, if you're listening, you learn so much. Jack Shear, so the deal with this was we were going to show almost 400 years of drawing that I had sort of found and sold to him. And the only rule that I had was it had to be works of art that he bought for me. Of course, I hung a few things that then he had to buy for the show at the same time, but that's being an art dealer. But the other deal was that Jack said, okay, but I'm installing it, you're not. We did have a few arguments about it, but he wanted to butt the drawings up beside each other, not to have any labels. So that you just have the visual experience, but that visual experience is a real test of are you looking or are you not? And the juxtapositions from Duchamp next to Richard Hamilton next to Jasper Johns, or Al Taylor next to Herman Nitsch and Dieter Roth and so on. Those are the challenges that we do. And of course, because you're challenged all the time, that's why I go back to if it's a tougher time, then you do different things. But we will survive, and we have to survive. And if you look back at history, the 70s was a terrible time for the art world. It was only in the beginning of the 80s, and I worked for Ileana Sonnabend, and when I was working there in 83 when I started, I had known her for a couple of years beforehand, but Ileana said, I can't believe this. We're now selling half a show, we're selling the entire show. David, this never happened in the 70s because there wasn't the same money around and the same largesse. The 80s was such a boom period, but of course, it can't be a boom all the time. Like
Right.
art, years have to go up and down too. Sorry, I've gone on too far.
Do you want to add to that, Valentina? You coming from a kind of art historical point of view, and as you said, working with living artists for the first time when you joined the gallery, what is your, what are you seeing right now? What do you feel is happening?
I think a gallery like David Nolan Gallery has never really followed trends or fashions imposed on the exterior. So David and now the two of us are very, very open. We don't want to, be crystallized and stuck in our aesthetic as it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago. It's always a growing process. And that's why I love working with David in this gallery. I couldn't work for a commercial gallery or a gallery where there was no whatsoever interest in.
Wait, we are commercial.
Commercial, like in a more superficial way, like more transactional, like oriented in a more transactional goal. Because for me, it's important to understand the work of the artist. And of course, there are artists that I'm more drawn to, both to their personality of work, but that doesn't matter. All the artists that we show, we both deeply respect, admire, and we believe in their works, and would do close to anything to fight for their work. I remember when we were working with Wardell Milan, we were fighting even much more intensely than Wardell would have ever hoped for or wanted, to have a huge billboard in LA showing his drawings or KKK of KKK. And
It
we
was on
had,
Sunset Boulevard.
yes, we had enormous pushback. And I told David, we're asking our lawyer as a third party to, to make clear to the billboard company that this is in no way a celebration of KKK. Actually, it's quite the opposite. And
but we fought for it and succeeded in the end.
Yes, and we didn't want to go for the sweeter, safer image by Wardell. We wanted to, be loyal to the original project, and we liked that it was so challenging in the right direction, reflecting our values as gallerists. And so I think
that was censorship in a way.
Yeah, so I think David has had, probably except very few exceptions, artists that have been working with him for many years, if not decades. And artists, I think, like working with us because we listen to them, we work together, we want to learn from them and really try and place their works in meaningful shows, venues, and with a rigorous approach. So I think as long as you pursue that, of course, you need to, be successful commercially, because otherwise you become a non-for-profit organization. And so there needs to be a balance. I'm not entirely naive, but I think it's a very mutually nourishing collaboration between us and this is our current shows, and it enriches us immensely to have, for example, here works by Jonathan Meze, who is an artist from our roster for a long time, but then Dennis Typhus and Tim Browner are artists that we are working with for the first time, and they continue to come to the gallery and spend time with us, which we love. And yesterday David he was in his office with Dennis, and I was thinking, what's going on? And it turns out Dennis was making for David a drawing, a two-hand drawing, to give him as a gift.
In the spirit of Diderot.
Yes,
so again, dialogue between something historical and contemporary.
So for us, it's very rewarding, I think, and we're lucky to be able to have fabulous artists. Chakaya Booker is another one that is very close to my heart, of the recent entries in our program, and she's somebody that I very much liked since the first time I saw a picture of her show, and I started asking, how about we show her work? And it has happened, and we are so thrilled, and think she is one of the superstars of.
But then Mel Kendrick, whose work you know very well, Mel Kendrick is, in my mind, one of the most rigorous, forward-looking American sculptors in the last 30 years. And what's nice is very young artists, conceptual artists like his work. And then for that big commission he got in Madison Square Park, it was Bryce Martin and Richard Serra, who were Frank Stella and so on, who all voted to, let's have something. So I like the artists, they really speak to other artists of different generations.
Mm. Well, I think an hour has breezed by, so I will hand things over to Joshua, because we're going to have questions and poetry.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you, Valentina and David, for such a wonderful conversation as well. We're going to move into the audience Q&A now. And our first question comes from Kendall. In the audience, Kendall writes, today the David Nolan Gallery is well established and successful. What has been your greatest challenge or challenges leading the gallery over these last decades? And how have you navigated this or these challenges?
Do I have to answer that question? That's it.
Thank you, Kendall.
That's a nice, tough question. Perseverance, stubbornness, sticking to what you believe in. And I think that is the part, and even Will's question earlier, I think today, even more than 5 years ago, yes, you've got to be really convinced of what you're doing and why you're doing it, because otherwise you just throw your hands up and say, this is too tough, I'm out. And I think one of the things since the very beginning, I mean, I started in the late 80s when many of the artists I was working with were German. The dollar tanked against the Deutschmark 3 months, 4 months after I opened my gallery. And I thought, oh my God, I've just bought all of these things and now it's going to cost 20 to 30% more. How am I going to survive? Yeah, it's a little courage, a little stupidness and stubbornness. But I do think you have to be very passionate and know why you're showing the things and doing the things, because if you're not convinced and don't have the passion, you're not going to survive.
In
Thank you.
many things.
Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question is, would you ever consider opening up other locations globally? And if so, where and why?
Well, we have done that. I did have a gallery also in Berlin for approximately 6 years. And I did it to sort of test myself and see, could I do this somewhere else? Luckily, I had a partner who was a good friend of mine, a Swiss man called Jörg Uden. So we had a lot of fun doing that. It was great to show some of the artists that I show in America and bring them to Germany. Also, if you have a gallery in a different place, yes, you communicate with a whole different public, from everyday visitors to collectors to curators and artists. And so actually those 6 years to me were very useful. And occasionally we would have a show that would start in New York and go to Berlin or vice versa. And that was actually a very rewarding experience. And we've done pop-ups. You know, I did one in London many years ago. I've done pop-ups actually with Bordel, that exhibition on the billboards in LA. But I think the problem for me was, unless you have a huge gallery with an enormous staff, I think it waters down what you're doing. Between the art fairs we do, working with museum shows, working with artists around the world, to have another location, I think, dilutes what the gallery stands for. And no, unless we can find a way where we can zap a button and be somewhere else in 2 minutes, no, I'm more for one location. We all travel enough. So, anything else you want to add to that, Valentina?
It reflects very much of our personal relationship that we foster and we privilege with artists, collectors, curators, and colleagues, other dealers. So I think for now, but who knows? It's always
Right.
good to change and try something new.
I wouldn't say never. I would just say not at the moment.
Alrighty, our next question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the choice for the yellow in the gallery?
Go ahead.
Okay, so that was a very fun story where what Valentina said. So I had a very fun, great relationship with Richard Arschwager. For many years, we did several shows, and then when I decided he should be the opening show in Chelsea, and I was in a studio in the country, and I said, by the way, Richard, here's, I think, the view, what should be from the street. I'm going to build a big window, bigger than all of the other galleries in Chelsea. I don't want all of these small little million windows, multi-panel. I want one huge window. And he said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. I think my idea is that, you know what? And he took out a piece of paper and a pencil and he started to draw. And he said, I think this is what it should look like. And after a few minutes, I thought, oh my God, okay, well, I have an architect, Markus Dushansky at MDA Studio. who's a good friend, and I'm going to call him and say, so could we bring Richard into designing it? And Marcus, being the all-embracive guy that he is, said, yeah, I'd love to hang out with Richard. And so Richard said, okay, see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in front of the facade. I brought a measuring tape, paper and pencils, and Richard and Marcus on the boot of a car drew out, and I brought a measuring tape to make sure that we get all the measurements there and then correct. So Richard designed the facade, and he gave me three choices. One was mid-cadmium yellow, which he said was the taxi color of Chelsea, being an artist, very practical. And I said, that's a nice one. He said, or it could be green. And I said, why green? He said, because you're Irish and I love the green grass that I see when I fly over Ireland. Or he said, the third one could be blue for the blue of the sky. And anyway, so we talked about that for a couple of days. And yellow, this mid-cadmium yellow, is something he uses frequently in his artwork, in his paintings. So I said, I do not want green, thanks very much. I want the yellow. So it was his mid-cadmium yellow. That's how it came about.
What a wonderful story.
Marcus is there to tell us the truth.
The next question that we have for you is if there was one artist or artists you wish you could have worked with back in the day, who would that be?
I hate questions like that. I would like to answer in a very cocky way by saying I showed everybody I wanted to show. I'd like to have worked more with Sigmar Polke. I knew Polke, of course, from the time I lived in Cologne, because Cologne in the early 80s was a tiny little art world. We all went to the same restaurants, so I knew him reasonably well. And I told him that at a certain point, and he said, well, okay, one of these days I'll come and visit you in New York. And my good friend, who I admire very much, Gordon Vennetlausen, brought Polke to the gallery one day. And so I said, Sigmar, I've done a second show without you, but I want to continue and I want to work with you. And I think Gordon and Michael Werner will allow it. And he said only on one circumstance. He said, you opened your gallery with my work. And if you close your gallery with my work, yes, we can work together. So that was his mean way of saying, nope, not unless you close your gallery, I'll do the final show. But Polke is somebody who I'd like to have done a lot more work with. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to, but Michael Werner and David Swerner and the others have done great jobs in all of that. But he is still one of my very close heroes.
On my side, Carol Rama.
Okay. Next.
Thank you for those answers. We have one last question before we'll move into the reading today. And this question reads, considering that you've been in different gallery spaces, how does the space inform or inspire the programming? The Upper East Side space has a more historical character compared to the more white cube space in Chelsea.
Well, I can start it since I went through several of the spaces, but I would say it does. It does. And that's part of, again, I don't want to overplay the challenges and the fun, but they are. Because when I started in Chelsea, yes, the architecture, which I designed the space myself, it was a raw space. So I designed it with a crazy Brazilian friend, Carlos Almeida. So that did, I designed the space with him. We designed it together. To show a certain scale and a certain type of work. But when I moved to Chelsea, again with Marcus Dushansky, and since I'm a frustrated architect from the early days, we had a dialogue. He probably would say that he designed all of it, but I say it was a healthy dialogue. And in Chelsea, yes, it was a bigger room to allow me to show bigger sculptures, to show bigger paintings, to have more flexibility in what I would show, which we did. And down all the way to the facade, indeed. And so when we moved up to town, it was into a townhouse. And actually, I have discovered that townhouses are amazingly flexible spaces because you can have a room of drawings in intimate space, or you can hang two big paintings or one big painting with drawings around it or a sculpture. And they are amazingly flexible spaces. But I'd say one of the fun challenges is, depending on the space, yes, it does force you to think about how the show should look. And we have, like, from Dorothea Rockburn making that arena chapel to Jakaya Booker, where she had this huge sculpture that was diagonally across the space. I think I love a different space to challenge me in a different way. And Valentina is very much sort of ahead of the game on that one at this point. She, for Paris, for the art fair recently, she also decided we should paint the walls pink to make it stand out and the art look really great on it. And it also made our booth look different than anybody's booth around us. So we like all of those.
I really like, and I know it goes against a very long wave of trend for the white cube gallery, but I remember when I was already working with David in Chelsea, and I would come to the Upper East Side in galleries with the fireplace and the wooden floor. I really liked that. So I couldn't believe when we found this space. I love a space. It doesn't matter. It could be contemporary architecture, but with character, and still it cannot overpower the space. But I love the contrast also of contemporary work in an older historical environment. I think it also, again, it changes a little bit the way we look at art, and I think it's always very interesting to observe what changes and what we learn from that experience.
Thank you so much for those answers, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We're going to end today's conversation with a reading now, and so I'll pass it back over to you, David.
Okay, Josh, thank you very much. So today, sort of for fun, when Josh suggested this idea of, David, do you have a poet or a poem? And of course I didn't. I wanted Fong or Josh to actually read the poem, but or Will to read the poem, actually, yes. But anyway, so I agreed, as I do sometimes to my detriment on certain things. But and the reason I sort of agreed in the end was because, not to be too romantic about it, not sentimental, but romantic. When I was growing up in Dublin, poetry and literature was a big thing because you're from Ireland, so it's a huge part. And you go to pubs, people talk about literature and writing all of the time. And actually, one of the people I befriended through some friends of mine from the north of Ireland was Seamus Heaney. And Seamus Heaney is one of the greatest poets ever. He is also, as many people say, if you know about Irish literature, he's the best poet since William Butler Yeats. Yeats is somebody who I love dearly and deeply, and James Lee Byers, I used to introduce him to all of my friends. And Seamus Heaney was a man who in the late 70s I spent a lot of time with. We would meet for about a year with these two friends of mine once a week in Capel Street in Dublin to listen to Irish music. And I got to know him, and one of the very nice things that I knew his poetry, of course, quite well at that point, but he also opened the way he spoke about the world, the way he spoke about humanity, and coming from the north of Ireland, which at that particular point was full, wrought with violence, terrorism, and so on. He spoke so beautifully about everybody around him, the landscape, his past, and it really touched me, also because he spoke in such a way, and if anybody has a chance to listen to him, his voice, his rasping, great voice is just beautiful and fantastic. Anyway, so I'm going to read from a poem that he wrote in 1966, from basically his first official book of poetry, which I think was called Death of a Naturalist in 1966. And the poem is titled Digging. And digging I like because digging is what we're doing today. So between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into the gravelly ground. My father digging, I look down, till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, coming up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through the potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, having sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch, the slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge, through living roots awakened in my head. I have no spade to follow men like him. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Thank you so much for sharing that poem with us, David. And thank you again to Valentina, you, David, as well as Will for this amazing conversation today. Thank you, Tarini from David Nolan Gallery also for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available tomorrow, join us at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Zach Feldman, Li Ming Hu, Charmaine Poe, and Chloe Stagaman on the occasion of likenesses speaking with the selves. And as is Rail tradition, we now invite you to turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Great
Very
conversation.
good.
Yeah.
Great.
Ah, hey,
Thank
Charlie.
you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Fong, of course, always.
Thank you, Fawn.
Thank you, Fong.
Bye, everyone.
Alright.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
This was